He worked slower than any mechanic they'd ever seen, checking every bolt twice, measuring every part 3 times. The other guys at the shop called him obsessive, maybe even crazy. What they didn't know was that in his previous job, one loose bolt could mean the difference between bringing his crew home alive or in body bags. Welcome to Interesting Human Stories. Before we dive into this powerful tale of precision, leadership, and the hidden warriors among us, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that every person has a story worth knowing, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter more than we realize. The morning sun cast long shadows across the oil-stained concrete floor of Garcia Auto Repair, a small independent shop on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. The building had seen better days, corrugated metal walls that rattled in the desert wind, fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently, and the perpetual smell of motor oil, transmission fluid, and honest work. Roberto "Bobby" Hernandez had owned the shop for 15 years, building it from a one-bay operation into a modest but respected business. He employed 4 full-time mechanics, each with their own personality and approach to the craft. There was Miguel, young and fast, who could swap an engine in record time. There was Carlos, the diesel specialist who somehow made truck engines purr like kittens. There was Tommy, the electronics wizard who could diagnose computer problems that baffled dealership technicians. And then there was Frank. Frank Morrison was 52 years old, with salt and pepper hair, weathered hands, and the kind of posture that suggested military service even when he was bent over an engine bay. He'd been working at Garcia's for 3 years, ever since Bobby had taken a chance on a man whose resume had an unexplained 10-year gap and whose references were mostly government phone numbers that went to voicemail. Frank was good at his job, exceptionally good. He could diagnose problems that stumped everyone else, could rebuild transmissions that other shops had declared hopeless, and had never, not once, had a customer return with the same problem twice. But he was slow, methodically, frustratingly slow. Where Miguel might spend 20 minutes replacing brake pads, Frank would spend an hour. Where Carlos could change oil in 15 minutes, Frank needed 30. Every bolt was checked, every connection tested, every component inspected as if lives depended on it. "Come on, Frank," Miguel would tease during their lunch breaks. "It's brake pads, not rocket science. Customers want their cars back this century." Tommy was less diplomatic. "Seriously, old man, you're killing our productivity numbers." Bobby's been asking questions about shop efficiency. Frank would just nod, continue eating his sandwich, and return to work with the same methodical precision that drove his younger coworker crazy. He never defended himself, never explained his approach, never mentioned that in his previous career good enough wasn't a concept that existed. What Frank's coworkers didn't understand was that his meticulous approach came from 22 years in the United States Army, with the last 12 as a tank commander in the 1st Armored Division. He had commanded M1 Abrams tanks through 2 deployments in Iraq, where mechanical failure wasn't an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. In the desert, there was no AAA to call, no tow truck to rescue you, no safe place to wait for help. When you were responsible for a 70-ton war machine and the 3 men inside it, every bolt mattered, every connection was critical, every component had to work perfectly every time. Frank had learned these lessons in the hardest possible way. It was during his 2nd deployment, outside Fallujah in 2006, that Sergeant First Class Morrison had received his battlefield promotion to tank commander. His predecessor, Staff Sergeant Jenkins, had been killed when their tank threw a track during a patrol. The cause, a single bolt on the final drive that had worked loose during maintenance, a minor oversight that sent 70 tons of steel careening into a roadside ditch at 30 miles per hour. Jenkins died on impact. His gunner, Specialist Rodriguez, lost his left leg. The driver, Private Chen, spent 6 months in physical therapy relearning how to walk. Frank had been the loader that day, the most junior member of the crew. He survived because he was in the safest position in the tank. He also survived to carry the weight of knowing that Jenkins' death could have been prevented by 5 more minutes of careful inspection. From that day forward, Master Sergeant Frank Morrison had developed a reputation in the Armored Corps for being obsessively thorough. His tanks never broke down. His crews never got stranded. His track record for mechanical reliability became legendary among maintenance officers who knew that Morrison's units could be counted on to complete any mission. But that reputation came with a cost. Other commanders joked that Morrison spent more time maintaining his tanks than fighting with them. Junior officers complained that his pre-mission inspections took twice as long as anyone else's. Some questioned whether his caution bordered on cowardice. Frank had ignored the criticism then, just as he ignored it now at Garcia's. He knew something that his critics didn't. In mechanical systems, there is no such thing as close enough. There is only working perfectly or failing catastrophically. The cultural clash between military precision and civilian automotive repair had been difficult for Frank to navigate when he first started at Garcia's. In the Army, maintenance was performed according to strict technical manuals, with detailed checklists and mandatory inspection procedures. Every component had a specified service life, every fluid had a replacement schedule, every system had built-in redundancies. Civilian auto repair operated on different principles: fix what's broken, ignore what's working, and get the customer back on the road as quickly and cheaply as possible. The approach made sense from a business perspective, but it went against everything Frank had learned about mechanical reliability. His first month at Garcia's had been particularly challenging. He'd been assigned to replace a timing belt on a Honda Civic, a routine job that should have taken 2 hours. Frank had spent 4 hours, not just replacing the belt but inspecting the timing chain tensioners, checking the water pump, testing the thermostat, and verifying that the cooling system was functioning properly. "Frank," Bobby had said, reviewing the work order, "the customer just wanted a timing belt. You've essentially given his car a complete engine inspection." The water pump was showing early signs of failure, Frank had explained. The thermostat was sticking intermittently. If the customer drives this car another 6 months without addressing these issues, he'll have a catastrophic cooling system failure that could destroy his engine. Bobby had stared at the detailed inspection report Frank had prepared, complete with digital photos and technical specifications. "How do you know all this?" "Experience," Frank had said simply. The customer had been initially skeptical about the additional repairs Frank recommended, but when Bobby showed him the photographic evidence of the failing components, he'd authorized the work. 3 months later, the customer had returned to thank them, explaining that his brother-in-law's identical Honda had suffered exactly the kind of cooling system failure Frank had predicted. Word had spread. Customers began specifically requesting Frank for major repairs, trusting his thoroughness even if it meant waiting longer for their vehicles. Bobby had noticed the pattern, and being a shrewd businessman, had started marketing Frank's services as premium diagnostic and repair, with correspondingly higher labor rates. The success of Frank's meticulous approach had only increased the resentment among his younger co-workers. Miguel, Carlos, and Tommy were all skilled mechanics in their own right, but they worked in the traditional automotive repair model. Diagnose the immediate problem, fix it efficiently, move on to the next job. Frank's method made their work look sloppy by comparison, and customers were beginning to notice. "Mr. Garcia," a customer named Sandra Williams had said during a recent visit, "last time I was here, the older mechanic, Frank, I think, he showed me all these pictures of what was wrong with my transmission, explained everything in detail, gave me a written report. This time, your guy just says it needs new brake pads and hands me a bill. How do I know he actually looked at everything?" Bobby had tried to smooth things over, but the message was clear. Frank's thoroughness was setting a new standard that customers expected from all the mechanics. The tension came to a head during a staff meeting in late March. "Look," Miguel had said, not bothering to hide his frustration, "I'm not saying Frank doesn't do good work, but he's making the rest of us look bad. Customers are starting to ask why their repairs don't come with detailed reports and photo documentation." Tommy nodded in agreement. "And it's not just the time thing anymore. He's got customers thinking that every oil change should include a complete vehicle inspection. That's not how this business works." Carlos, usually the peacemaker, had tried to find middle ground. "Maybe we could adopt some of Frank's documentation methods without slowing down our workflow." "His workflow is the problem," Miguel had snapped. "Yesterday I watched him spend 20 minutes adjusting the torque on lug nuts. 20 minutes. I can mount and balance 4 tires in that time." Frank had listened to the complaints without comment, his expression neutral. When Bobby asked if he had anything to say in response, Frank had simply shrugged. "In my previous job," he'd said quietly, "taking shortcuts got people killed. I understand that's not the case here, but I can't change how I work. If that's a problem, I'll understand if you need to let me go." The room had fallen silent. Bobby had ended the meeting without making any decisions, but the unspoken message was clear: something had to change. The opportunity for Frank to prove his worth, or to finally be exposed as overly cautious, came 3 weeks later in the form of a 2018 Ford F-350 Super Duty with a complex transmission problem. The truck belonged to Jim Castellanos, a local contractor who used it to tow heavy equipment trailers. The transmission was slipping intermittently, but only under specific load conditions. 2 other shops had diagnosed the problem as a complete transmission rebuild, a $4,000 repair that would put the truck out of service for a week. Castellanos had brought the truck to Garcia's as a last resort, hoping for a second opinion that might save him money and downtime.
Bobby had assigned the diagnostic to Miguel, who was the fastest at electrical troubleshooting. Miguel had spent 2 hours with the truck, running it through various tests and checking computer codes. His diagnosis matched the other shops. The transmission needed a complete rebuild. Internal damage to the valve body and torque converter, Miguel had reported. "It's toast, boss. $4,000 minimum, probably more once we get inside and see what else is damaged." Castellanos had winced at the estimate. "That's what the other guys said, but I'm hoping there's another option. This truck is my livelihood, and I can't afford to have it down for a week." Bobby had been about to approve the rebuild when Frank had quietly approached them. "Mind if I take a look?" Frank had asked. Miguel had bristled. "I already diagnosed it. Internal transmission damage. There's nothing else to check. I'd like to look anyway," Frank had said mildly. Bobby had agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly to see if Frank's thoroughness would reveal anything Miguel had missed. Frank had spent 4 hours with the truck, not just running diagnostics, but physically inspecting every component of the drivetrain. He'd crawled underneath with a flashlight, removed access panels, tested connections that other mechanics never bothered to check. What he'd found was a problem that nobody else had considered, a failing universal joint in the drive shaft that was causing microscopic vibrations at specific RPM ranges. The vibrations were subtle enough that they didn't affect normal driving, but under heavy load conditions, they caused the transmission's electronic control system to misinterpret sensor data and trigger protective slip mode. The solution wasn't a $4,000 transmission rebuild, it was a $150 universal joint replacement. The repair took Frank 2 hours, including the time he spent documenting the problem with detailed photographs and explanations. When Castellanos came to pick up his truck, Frank walked him through the entire diagnosis, showing him exactly what had been wrong and why the other shops had misdiagnosed the problem. "You see," Frank explained, pointing to the worn universal joint, "this failure was causing harmonic vibrations that peaked at exactly the RPM range where you were experiencing transmission slip. The transmission wasn't actually damaged, it was just responding to false sensor data by going into protective mode." Castellanos had tested the truck by towing his heaviest trailer around the block. The transmission performed flawlessly. "Son of a bitch," Castellanos had said, shaking Frank's hand. "You just saved me $4,000 and a week of downtime. How did you figure this out when 2 other shops missed it?" Frank had shrugged modestly. "Experience with heavy mechanical systems. Sometimes the obvious answer isn't the right answer." Word of Frank's diagnostic success spread quickly through the local contracting community. Within 2 weeks, Garcia's had received calls from 6 other contractors asking specifically for Frank to diagnose transmission problems that other shops couldn't solve. Miguel had been forced to admit that Frank's thoroughness had paid off in a way that pure speed never could. "I still think you're too slow," he'd told Frank during a lunch break. "But I guess there's something to be said for actually finding the right problem instead of just finding a problem." Tommy had been more direct in his praise. "That universal joint thing was brilliant. I would never have thought to check drivetrain components for a transmission issue. How did you know to look there?" For the first time since starting at Garcia's, Frank had opened up slightly about his background. "I spent 22 years maintaining military vehicles," he'd said. "In that environment, you learn that problems aren't always where they appear to be. A cooling system failure might be caused by electrical issues. A transmission problem might be caused by engine mounts. Everything in a mechanical system is connected." Carlos had asked the question they'd all been wondering. "What kind of military vehicles?" Frank had hesitated for a moment, then answered simply, "Tanks." The word tanks had hung in the air like a revelation that recontextualized everything they thought they knew about Frank Morrison. Suddenly, his methodical approach made perfect sense. His obsession with documentation, his refusal to accept good enough as a standard, his ability to diagnose complex mechanical problems that stumped everyone else. "Wait," Miguel had said, "you mean like actual tanks, with guns and armor and stuff?" Frank had nodded. "I was a tank commander for 12 years. Tommy's eyes had widened. "Dude, those things weigh like 70 tons and cost millions of dollars. No wonder you're careful about every bolt." "How many tanks did you command?" Carlos had asked. "Different numbers at different times," Frank had replied. "As a sergeant, I commanded 1 tank with a 4-man crew. As a Master Sergeant, I was responsible for maintenance oversight on an entire company. 14 tanks, 56 crew members." The revelation had changed the entire dynamic at Garcia's. The younger mechanics began asking Frank questions about military life, about tank operations, about the mechanical systems that kept multi-million-dollar war machines operational in combat conditions. Frank had remained modest about his service, but gradually shared some of the technical aspects of tank maintenance that applied to civilian automotive repair. The principle is the same, he'd explained during one lunch break discussion. Whether it's a Honda Civic or an M1 Abrams, mechanical systems fail in predictable ways. Heat, vibration, contamination, wear, these are universal problems. The difference is scale and consequence. What do you mean by consequence? Tommy had asked. Frank had considered his answer carefully. In civilian automotive repair, mechanical failure means inconvenience and expense. In tank maintenance, mechanical failure means your crew doesn't come home. Over the following months, Frank began informally mentoring his younger coworkers, sharing diagnostic techniques and maintenance philosophies developed during his military service. He taught them to look beyond obvious symptoms to identify root causes, to document their work with military precision, to treat every repair as if lives depended on it. The transformation in Garcia's shop culture was remarkable. Miguel learned to slow down and be more thorough in his diagnostics. Tommy began creating detailed documentation for complex electrical repairs. Carlos started performing comprehensive system checks instead of just fixing immediate problems. Customer satisfaction scores improved dramatically. Repeat business increased. Bobby began receiving referrals from other shops that couldn't solve difficult diagnostic problems. Frank, Bobby had said during their quarterly performance review, I want you to know that your approach to this work has elevated the entire shop. We're not just fixing cars anymore, we're solving problems that other people can't solve. Frank had accepted the praise with typical modesty, but privately he felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the military, a sense of purpose beyond mere employment. The young mechanics weren't just learning technical skills from Frank, they were absorbing his philosophy of craftsmanship, his commitment to excellence, his understanding that mechanical work was ultimately about taking care of people. You know what I realized? Miguel had said during a recent conversation. The way Frank approaches car repair is the same way a doctor should approach surgery. Every detail matters, every step has to be perfect, because somebody's depending on you to get it right. Frank's reputation for solving impossible problems had spread beyond the local contracting community. Automotive technicians from other shops began calling Garcia's for technical advice on complex diagnostics. Part suppliers started referring customers with unusual problems to Frank specifically. The Arizona Independent Automotive Service Association invited Frank to speak at their annual technical conference about advanced diagnostic techniques. It was the first time he'd been asked to share his expertise publicly since leaving the military. I'm not much of a public speaker, Frank had told Bobby when the invitation arrived. You don't have to give speeches, Bobby had replied. Just teach them what you've been teaching us. Show them how to think about mechanical problems the way you do. Frank's presentation at the conference was titled, Systems Thinking in Automotive Diagnostics, Lessons from Military Maintenance. He spoke to an audience of 200 automotive professionals about the importance of understanding interconnected systems, about the difference between fixing symptoms and solving problems, about the critical role of documentation and quality control. The presentation was a surprise hit. Attendees approached Frank throughout the day with questions about his diagnostic methods, his documentation systems, his approach to training junior technicians. Several shop owners offered him jobs at substantially higher salaries. Frank had politely declined all the offers. Garcia's auto repair was more than just his workplace now, it was his second chance at building something meaningful. 1 year after the universal joint diagnosis that had established Frank's reputation, Jim Castellanos returned to Garcia's with a different kind of request. Frank, he'd said, I've got a business proposition for you. My construction company is expanding, and I'm buying a fleet of heavy equipment. I need someone who understands maintenance management for complex mechanical systems. Interested in a consulting job? The offer was tempting. More money, regular hours, air-conditioned offices. But Frank had found something at Garcia's that he'd been looking for without knowing it, the satisfaction of teaching others, of building something that would outlast his individual contribution. I appreciate the offer, Jim, Frank had replied, but I think I'm where I belong. Bobby had overheard the conversation and approached Frank later that day. You know, Bobby had said, I've been thinking about expanding the business, maybe adding a training center where experienced mechanics like you could teach advanced diagnostic techniques to younger technicians. Would you be interested in heading something like that? Frank had considered the proposal carefully. It would mean leaving the hands-on work he loved, but it would also mean multiplying his impact, teaching dozens or hundreds of mechanics the principles he'd learned through hard experience. Let me think about it, Frank had said. That evening, Frank had sat in his small apartment, looking through a box of military photographs and commendations that he rarely opened. There were pictures of his tank crews, young men who'd trusted him to bring them home safely. There were maintenance awards, recognition of his unit's mechanical readiness rates, letters of commendation from commanding officers. At the bottom of the box was a folded letter he'd never been able to throw away. It was from Rosa Rodriguez, the wife of his former gunner who'd lost his leg in the tank accident that had changed everything. "Sergeant Morrison," the letter read, "Miguel told me about the extra maintenance checks you've implemented since taking command. He says the other tank commanders think you're being too cautious, but I want you to know that this wife and mother appreciates every extra minute you spend making sure those machines are safe. Thank you for taking care of my husband." Frank had refolded the letter and made his decision. The next morning he'd told Bobby he was interested in the training center proposal, but with conditions. "I want to stay involved in hands-on work," Frank had said. "Teaching is important, but I need to keep working on actual problems, and I want the curriculum to emphasize more than just technical skills. I want to teach people why this work matters, why precision and care are not just professional standards but moral obligations." Bobby had agreed to all of Frank's conditions, and they'd begun planning the Garcia Institute for Advanced Automotive Diagnostics. 6 months later, the training center opened in a renovated building next to Garcia's main shop. Frank had designed the curriculum personally, drawing on military maintenance protocols adapted for civilian automotive applications. The program attracted experienced technicians from across the Southwest, mechanics who wanted to advance their careers by mastering complex diagnostic techniques. But Frank's classes taught more than technical skills. They taught a philosophy of craftsmanship that transformed how students approached their work. Miguel, Carlos, and Tommy had all become assistant instructors, sharing the practical applications of Frank's methods that they'd learned through daily experience. The program had a waiting list 6 months long, and graduates were being recruited by premium service centers that specialized in difficult diagnostic problems. Frank had found his second career, but more importantly, he'd found peace with his first one. The meticulous attention to detail that had once been driven by the fear of losing soldiers was now motivated by the satisfaction of developing craftsmen. Frank Morrison still arrives at Garcia's every morning at 7 a.m., an hour before the shop officially opens. He uses that quiet time to review the previous day's work, to prepare for the training classes he'll teach later, to maintain the standards that have become synonymous with his name. The young mechanics no longer call him obsessive or crazy, they call him professor or sergeant, titles that carry respect earned through competence and generosity. Customers throughout Phoenix know that when they have a problem no one else can solve, there's a quiet man at Garcia's Auto Repair who will spend whatever time it takes to find the right answer. They know their vehicles will be returned in better condition than when they arrived, with documentation that proves every system has been checked and verified. Frank has never spoken publicly about the tank accident that shaped his approach to mechanical work. He's never told his students about the nightmares that drove him to perfectionism, about the weight of responsibility that made shortcuts impossible. But sometimes, late in the evening when the shop is closed and he's alone with his thoughts, Frank looks at the graduation photos on his office wall, dozens of young technicians who've learned to approach their work with the same precision and care that once kept tank crews alive. He thinks about Master Sergeant Jenkins, who died because of a single loose bolt. He thinks about Specialist Rodriguez, who trusted his tank commander to bring him home safely. He thinks about all the soldiers, and all the mechanics, and all the customers who depend on someone else's commitment to excellence, and he knows that every properly torqued bolt, every thoroughly documented repair, every carefully trained technician is a small victory against the carelessness that costs lives and destroys trust. Frank Morrison may no longer command tanks, but he still commands respect. And in a world that too often settles for good enough, he continues to prove that perfect is not just possible, it's necessary. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Frank Morrison? Someone whose attention to detail seemed excessive until you understood where it came from? Someone who brought military precision to civilian work and made everyone around them better? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the quiet professionals who refuse to cut corners, because here at Interesting Human Stories, we believe that excellence is not an accident, it's a choice. And the people who choose excellence, day after day, regardless of whether anyone notices, are the ones who keep the world running safely. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Help us honor the craftsmen and women who understand that their work matters, who take pride in doing things right, who remember that behind every mechanical system is a human being who trusts them to care. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember, the person working carefully while others rush might be the one person you want on your side when precision matters most.